Every town has its whispered legends, the kind passed from one generation to the next in hushed tones, usually at sleepovers, bonfires, or in classrooms when the teacher's back is turned. Ours was no different, though the story we grew up with was darker, heavier, and it carried a weight that none of us wanted to admit we actually believed in. The story was of the woman in the well. Long before any of us were born, before the streets had been paved or the grocery store had opened, there had been a farm on the far edge of town, run by a man and his wife. They had no children, no friends, and no neighbors nearby, just the farmhouse, a field of dead corn stalks, and a stone well that stood crooked at the back of the property. No one ever agreed on the details, but the legend always ended the same way. The woman disappeared. Some said her husband drowned her in the well after a violent argument. Others swore she had gone mad with loneliness and had thrown herself into the water, her screams echoing through the town at night. And there were those, the older folks with their serious eyes and unshakable tone, who insisted that she had been neither murdered nor suicidal, but cursed. Whatever the truth was, her body was never recovered, and the farm rotted into ruin until only the well remained, like an open wound in the earth. As children, we treated the story like a game, but only from a safe distance. You could joke about her in the daylight, but never at night. Parents warned us never to go near the place, and although kids are naturally rebellious, most of us obeyed without question. There was something about the well itself. Those who had gone close described it as unsettling in ways they couldn't explain. The stones were slick with moss, the rim chipped and sharp, and the air around it seemed colder, like it was always in shadow no matter how bright the sun was overhead. People swore if you leaned too close and looked down, you'd see more than your reflection. Sometimes you'd see pale hands just beneath the surface of the water, or a face floating upward, eyes wide and mouth frozen in a silent scream. No one ever stayed long enough to find out if what they saw was real. By the time we reached high school, the legend had shifted from a tale to scare little kids into a rite of passage. If you wanted to prove yourself, to show you weren't scared, you went to the well. Sometimes it was just to touch the rim, sometimes to toss a stone inside and wait for the splash. And sometimes, for the bravest or the most foolish, it meant leaning over and whispering her name 3 times. Maribeth. That was the name attached to her in the oldest versions of the story, and saying it was like signing a contract. Nobody ever claimed to finish the dare completely. Those who tried always said they chickened out at the last second, but their pale faces and trembling voices suggested otherwise. We never pressed them. We knew the fear wasn't fake. The well became a magnet for our curiosity, though most of us still circled it from afar. Every Halloween, a handful of kids would sneak out there with flashlights, daring each other to get closer than the last. No one ever went alone, of course. Not until that one summer, when the night stretched longer, the boredom heavier, and the old stories seemed more like challenges than warnings. That was the summer everything changed. We were 16, restless, desperate to prove ourselves, and foolish enough to ignore every instinct screaming at us to stay away. What started as a harmless dare between friends turned into something else entirely, something we could never laugh off again. And it all began with the decision to visit the well, not as children whispering about ghosts, but as teenagers, certain we were untouchable. Blind to the fact that some stories are not just stories, they're invitations. It was July when the dare finally took shape, one of those suffocating summer nights when the air itself felt heavy, sticky with humidity, and boredom clung to us like sweat. There were 6 of us crammed onto the back porch of Ryan's house. Me, Ryan, his cousin Tyler, and our friends Megan, Chris, and Jenna. We had exhausted the usual ways of killing time: video games, bad horror movies, stealing beers from Ryan's dad's garage fridge, and eventually the conversation circled, as it always did, back to the well. Tyler was the first to bring it up, smirking the way he always did when he thought he was being clever. He said, "Bet none of you have the guts to do it," and the rest of us groaned because we knew exactly what it meant. Still, the words hung in the air heavier than the heat, daring us to grab hold. None of us wanted to look weak, not in front of each other. That was the danger of the story. It fed on pride. Ryan leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, like he was trying to look casual, but I could see the flicker in his eyes. "Plenty of people have gone out there," he said. "It's nothing but some old rocks and a hole in the ground." His voice carried confidence, but his foot tapped nervously against the porch. Megan laughed at him, tossing her blonde hair over her shoulder. "If it's nothing, then why don't we go tonight? Prove it." That's how it always started. Half a joke, half a challenge, but none of us could back down once it was spoken out loud. Chris shifted uncomfortably, muttering something about how it was stupid, but even he didn't outright refuse, because refusing meant weakness, and weakness meant ridicule. By midnight, we had worked ourselves into a frenzy of false bravery. We packed flashlights, grabbed hoodies to ward off the night air, and set off across town on our bikes. The ride itself was almost fun, the kind of reckless adventure teenagers live for, pedaling down empty streets with the wind in our hair and the moon overhead. But as we left the pavement behind and turned onto the dirt road that led toward the old farmland, the excitement began to drain from us. The trees pressed in closer here, their branches clawing at the sky, and the sound of crickets grew deafening, filling the silence we refused to break. Our flashlights cut weak beams through the darkness, bouncing off trunks and weeds that seemed to move just out of sight. It was as though the night itself was warning us away. When we reached the clearing, it was almost anticlimactic at first. The remnants of the farmhouse were nothing but a few rotting beams jutting from the ground, half hidden in weeds taller than we were. And there, in the center, stood the well. It was smaller than I had imagined, squat and lopsided, built of gray stone that had crumbled in places. The wooden cover that must have once protected it was long gone, leaving only a gaping mouth that seemed too dark, too deep, like it didn't belong to this world. We dropped our bikes in the grass and stood there, none of us willing to be the first to move closer. The air around it was colder, just like people always said, and when the wind shifted, it carried with it the faint smell of stagnant water, damp and rotten. Tyler broke the silence with a laugh that was a little too loud, a little too forced. "That's it? This is what everyone is scared of? A stupid hole?" He strode forward, kicking a loose stone with his sneaker, and leaned against the rim as if daring the rest of us to call him out. But even from a distance, I saw the way his hand twitched when he touched the moss-slick stone, and the way he quickly pulled it back as though it had burned him. Ryan followed, then Megan, and eventually the rest of us edged closer until we stood in a loose circle around the well. The darkness inside seemed endless. We couldn't see the bottom, not even with our flashlights angled toward it. The beams were swallowed whole, as though the well drank the light itself. "Someone should say her name," Jenna whispered. Her voice trembled, but there was a thrill in it too, the kind that comes from standing at the edge of a cliff and daring yourself to jump. No one responded right away. The crickets had gone silent now, leaving only the faint rustle of leaves in the trees. My heart thudded in my chest so loudly it drowned out my thoughts. Tyler finally grinned, baring his teeth like he was enjoying the tension. He said, "Fine." Leaning over the rim, he said, "Maribeth." He let the name linger in the air, then repeated it, louder this time. "Maribeth." The sound of it made my skin crawl, like a cold hand sliding down my spine. When he said it the third time, the night seemed to hold its breath.
The silence that followed Tyler's third whisper was suffocating. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was heavier than that, as though the night itself had been smothered, like someone had pressed a hand against the world's mouth. Even the wind seemed to have stopped, the branches frozen mid-sway above us. I remember holding my breath without realizing it, waiting for the punchline, waiting for Tyler to laugh and say he had tricked us. But his smirk faltered almost instantly, and when he leaned back from the well, there was a flicker of something in his eyes I'd never seen before – doubt. His flashlight trembled in his hand, the beam twitching across the stones. For a moment, none of us moved. Then Megan broke the silence with a shaky laugh that rang false in the stillness. "See? Nothing," she said, her voice too high. But even as she said it, her arms wrapped tightly across her chest as if she were cold. That was when we heard it. At first I thought it was just the echo of Tyler's last word, Marybeth, bouncing faintly off the stones. But no, it wasn't an echo. It was lower, wetter, dragged out, as though someone were forcing the syllables through a mouth full of water. Marybeth. The sound seeped from the darkness below, climbing upward with a sluggish, gurgling weight that my stomach twisted. Jenna gasped and stumbled backward, nearly tripping over Chris, who muttered, "Jesus Christ!" under his breath. Ryan shined his flashlight straight into the well, but the beam was swallowed whole, reflecting nothing, as if the bottom simply didn't exist. Then, faintly, a splash echoed from below, far deeper than it should have been. We tried to tell ourselves it was just water, maybe a stone that Tyler had dislodged. But then came the scratching, slow, deliberate, nails or something like them scraping against the slick stone walls of the well. The sound clawed at my ears, setting my teeth on edge. It wasn't random, it was climbing, inch by inch, deliberate as a predator stalking prey. "It's just an animal," Ryan whispered, but his voice cracked halfway through. None of us believed him. Megan clutched my arm so tightly her nails dug crescents into my skin, and when I glanced at her, her face was pale, her lips trembling as though she were about to cry. The air grew colder, not the kind of chill you get from a summer breeze, but a bone-deep cold that made our breath fog in front of us. The smell intensified too, no longer just stagnant water but something fouler, like rot and decay, as though the well had exhaled the breath of something that had been dead a long, long time. My flashlight flickered once, twice, then steadied. But I swore the beam had caught something pale just at the rim of the darkness below. A shape, a shimmer of white, gone before I could even gasp. Tyler cursed under his breath, stumbling back from the well, but his bravado was gone, replaced by wide-eyed panic. Then came the sound that silenced us all completely. A laugh. Not loud, not joyful, just a low, gurgling chuckle, like someone drowning and laughing at the same time. It rose from the depths, curling upward like smoke, wrapping itself around us until I felt it inside my chest. Jenna screamed, high and piercing, and dropped her flashlight, which rolled into the grass. Its beam cut across the ground, and for a split second I saw what I thought was a hand, pale, dripping, fingers too long curling over the edge of the well. I blinked, and it was gone. But the stone rim was wet, slick with moisture that hadn't been there before. "Enough!" Chris snapped suddenly, his voice sharp with fear disguised as anger. He grabbed Tyler's arm and yanked him back, away from the rim. "We're done. We're not doing this anymore." None of us argued. None of us wanted to. We stumbled back from the well, tripping over weeds and each other, retreating toward our bikes like frightened children. The cold seemed to follow us, clinging to our clothes, the smell of rot thick in our noses. I remember glancing over my shoulder one last time before we left, my flashlight beam sliding across the stone rim. That was when I saw it. Water trickling down the outside of the well, as though it were overflowing from within, though we hadn't heard a drop until that moment. The stones glistened as though they were weeping. We didn't speak on the ride home. We just pedaled hard, our wheels crunching over gravel, our breaths ragged, none of us daring to look back. The night felt heavier now, the darkness denser, and though we left the clearing behind us, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't left it all there, that something had followed. For a while, we convinced ourselves we had left it behind. That night, after the frantic ride home, I collapsed into bed, still dressed, sweat drying cold against my skin, the stink of the well clinging to my clothes. I told myself it was all in our heads, that the noises, the laughter, and the pale shape I swore I saw were just tricks of fear and imagination. But as I lay there staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the silence that had swallowed the woods, the unnatural cold that had seeped into my bones, and the way the stones had glistened with water that shouldn't have been there. Sleep eventually dragged me under, heavy and restless, and that's when the dreams began. In them, I stood at the rim of the well again, but this time alone. The air smelled of damp earth. The sky above was a black void without stars, and when I leaned forward to look inside, a face surfaced, bloated, gray, with hair floating like strands of seaweed. The eyes opened suddenly wide and milky, and the mouth stretched unnaturally until it filled the darkness with a scream that wasn't sound but vibration, shaking me awake in a cold sweat. The next day, none of us wanted to admit what we felt. We tried to act normal, hanging out at Ryan's house again, but the energy was off. Tyler was jumpy, his usual cocky swagger replaced with distracted fidgeting. Megan barely spoke at all, picking at her fingernails until they bled. Jenna avoided everyone's eyes, staring instead at the floor as though something there fascinated her. Chris was the only one who tried to pretend nothing had happened, cracking jokes and insisting we had psyched ourselves out. But even he couldn't hide the bags beneath his eyes, or the way he flinched whenever a shadow moved in the room. It wasn't just fear, it was exhaustion. None of us had slept well, and all of us were haunted by dreams too similar to ignore. When Ryan finally admitted that he heard the same laugh in his sleep, bubbling up from the darkness of the well, we all fell silent. We didn't want to believe it, but it was undeniable. Something had come back with us. It escalated quickly. At first, it was little things, lights flickering, doors creaking open on their own, a cold draft in the middle of the night. Then it grew. Megan swore she heard water dripping in her room, but when she turned on the light, her floor was dry. Tyler found muddy handprints on the inside of his bedroom window, though his second-story room was too high for anyone to reach from outside. Jenna stopped coming around altogether after she woke to find her hair soaked, the smell of stagnant water heavy in her pillow. She texted us once, just once, "She's here." That was the last message any of us ever got from her. She wouldn't answer calls, and when we biked past her house, her blinds were shut tight, the lights inside dark. The rest of us weren't much better. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my sheets damp as though I'd been pulled dripping from a river. Some nights I'd hear faint splashing under my bed, rhythmic and steady, as though water were lapping against stone. The smell of rot clung to my room, sour and heavy, no matter how often I cleaned. And then came the voices. At first they were muffled, like hearing someone whisper through a wall, but soon they grew clearer, always the same name stretched out in that gurgling drawl, Mary-Beth.
The breaking point came one night at Ryan's. We had gathered in his basement, desperate to reassure ourselves we weren't losing our minds. "It's just a story," Chris insisted, pacing in front of us, though his hands shook. We're feeding it. If we stop talking about it, stop thinking about it, it'll stop. But even as he spoke, water began dripping from the ceiling. At first, just a few drops, then a steady stream, soaking the old carpet until the smell of rot filled the air. We scrambled to move, but before we could, the light bulb above us flickered and burst, plunging the room into darkness. That was when we heard it again. The laugh. Low, gurgling, so close this time, it felt like it was inside the room with us. Tyler screamed, and when my flashlight finally cut through the dark, I saw him on the floor, clawing at his ankle. His sock was drenched, water pooling around him, though the carpet beneath the rest of us was dry. Something pale and wet had wrapped around his leg, pulling hard enough to drag him across the floor. We all lunged to help, grabbing his arms, his shoulders, anything to hold him back. My hands closed around his wrist, slick with water, as his screams echoed in my ears. For a moment, it felt like we were tugging against a current, as though the basement floor had become the surface of a river trying to swallow him whole. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Tyler lay gasping on the carpet, his legs soaked, his skin pale and clammy. The water was gone, as if it had never been there, but the smell lingered. We didn't sleep that night. We just sat in silence, too afraid to move, too afraid to speak, waiting for the next sign that she wasn't finished with us. And deep down, I think we all knew the truth. She had only just begun.
After the basement incident, everything unraveled. We stopped pretending this was paranoia, stopped pretending that if we ignored it long enough it would fade. Instead, it grew, stretching invisible fingers into every corner of our lives, seeping into the spaces we thought were safe. Days bled into nights without rest. The nightmares never left us, dragging us back to the well again and again, always standing at its rim, always hearing the water churn, always seeing that face rising from the depths with milky eyes and a mouth stretched too wide. Each time, she seemed closer, her features sharper, her movements more deliberate, as if dream by dream she was climbing toward us. And even when we woke, we didn't wake entirely. The smell of damp rot clung to our clothes, our hair, our skin. We carried it with us like a stain. Teachers noticed our exhaustion, our blank stares in class. Parents asked questions we couldn't answer. None of us dared tell the truth, because what words could we even use? How do you explain that a woman who drowned over 100 years ago was crawling her way back into the world through us? Jenna was the first to disappear. Her absence had begun with silence, no texts, no calls, her curtains always drawn tight. Then one afternoon, Megan showed up at my house pale and shaking, clutching her phone like a lifeline. "She sent me a video," Megan whispered, pressing play with trembling fingers. The screen flickered to life, and there was Jenna, her face lit only by the glow of her phone. She was crying, whispering in frantic gasps about water in her room, about voices chanting her name, about something climbing out of her closet. Then, midway through, she dropped the phone. The last image was her bare feet dragging across the floor, wet hair trailing behind her as if pulled by something unseen. The video cut to black, and that was it. When Megan tried calling, the number was disconnected. Later, when we biked past Jenna's house, there was an emptiness to it, an unnatural stillness, as though the building itself was holding its breath. None of us went near the door. Tyler unraveled next. He stopped joking, stopped showing off, his arrogance drowned beneath sheer terror. He came to us one night with dark circles beneath his eyes, muttering that he could hear dripping water everywhere, school hallways, the grocery store, even inside his car when it hadn't rained in weeks. His ankle, the one that had been grabbed in the basement, grew swollen and purple, the veins dark as though something beneath the skin was spreading. He limped constantly, his movements sluggish, his face gray. We begged him to go to a doctor, but he just shook his head, muttering that she was inside him now, that there was no point. 1 week later, he was gone. His parents said they found his room flooded, water soaking the floorboards, his bed empty except for a puddle that smelled like rot. There was no sign of him, no footprints leaving the house, just water, always water. Chris tried to fight it in his own way, insisting we meet every night, keep each other awake, remind ourselves of what was real. But even his stubbornness cracked. One evening, as we sat in Ryan's garage, he suddenly froze mid-sentence, eyes locked on something none of us could see. "She's behind you," he whispered to Megan, his voice hollow. And before we could ask what he meant, he began to choke. His hands clawed at his throat, his face turning purple as though invisible fingers had wrapped tight around his neck. We lunged toward him, trying to pry his hands free, but they wouldn't budge. His skin slipped with water. His eyes bulged, foam spilling from his lips, and then, just as quickly, it stopped. He collapsed, gasping, water dripping from his mouth and pooling at his feet. He wouldn't speak of it afterward, wouldn't even acknowledge what had happened. But that night, he vanished too. His mother said she heard splashing in the bathroom, then silence. When she knocked on the door, the floor was soaked, the tub filled to the brim, though no faucet ran, and Chris was gone. The police said maybe he had run away, but we knew better. That left only me, Ryan, and Megan. The three of us clung to each other desperately, refusing to separate, terrified of being alone. We slept in shifts, lights on, our nerves frayed to breaking. But it didn't matter. She didn't need darkness. She didn't need sleep. One night, Megan woke up screaming, thrashing in her blanket. By the time we pulled her upright, her hair was dripping wet, her eyes wide and unblinking. She whispered that she felt hands pulling her down, dragging her to some unseen depth. We tried everything: prayers, salt, candles, even calling a priest, but nothing helped. The smell of rot followed us everywhere, and at night the sound of dripping water became constant, echoing through the house. I began to wonder if we had been marked from the moment Tyler said her name 3 times. That this was never a game, never a dare. It had always been a summoning, a contract sealed with sound. By then, none of us needed to say it out loud. We all knew what awaited us. The well wasn't just a place anymore. It was a mouth that had opened, and once opened, it would never close. One by one, we were being pulled back into it. By the end, the 3 of us knew there was nowhere left to run. The police thought our friends had vanished by choice. Neighbors whispered about drugs or cults, and our parents were too frightened to see the truth. But we knew. Every creak of the floorboards, every dripping faucet, every shadow that lingered too long in the corner. It was her. Maribeth wasn't bound to the well anymore. She had crawled free, following us, tethered by the foolish dare that had awakened her. We tried staying at Ryan's, huddled together in his room with the lights blazing and the windows nailed shut. For 2 nights, we managed only shallow sleep, jolting awake at the faintest sound. On the 3rd night, Megan started whispering in her sleep. At first, we thought she was dreaming, but when I leaned closer, my stomach turned to ice. She was repeating the name, Ma, Air, Beth, over and over, her lips moving as if controlled by someone else. I shook her awake, but her eyes opened blank and distant, water trickling from the corners of her mouth. The mattress beneath her was soaked through. Ryan and I pulled her off the bed, shouting her name, but she just stared past us, her lips still forming the name like a prayer. Then, without warning, her body jerked forward, dragged across the floor by something unseen. We clawed at her arms, but she slid faster, pulled toward the door, nails scraping across the wood. The door slammed shut before we could reach her, and when we finally broke it open, the hallway was empty except for a trail of wet footprints leading toward the stairs, footprints that disappeared halfway down. Megan was gone. After that, Ryan and I didn't bother pretending anymore. We both knew we were next. He wanted to go back to the well, convinced that if we returned her name, reversed the dare somehow, maybe we could end it. I wasn't so sure, but I was too exhausted, too broken to argue. So we rode out one last time, our bikes rattling over the dirt road, the moon high and swollen in the sky. The clearing looked the same as it had the first night. Ruined farmhouse, tall weeds, the crooked circle of stone. But this time, the air was thick with mist, curling around our ankles, carrying that smell of rot so strong that it made me gag. The well seemed deeper than before, the darkness inside pulsing faintly, as though it breathed. Ryan walked straight to the rim, his flashlight shaking in his hand. "We give it back," he said, his voice thin. "We say it together. Maybe that will close it." I wanted to believe him, so we leaned over and spoke the name, once, twice, 3 times, our voices trembling. The silence that followed was unbearable, thick as mud. Then, slowly, the water stirred. I'll never forget what came next. At first it was just bubbles, then ripples, then a hand, pale, waterlogged, fingers too long, grasping the inner stones and pulling upward. Another hand followed, then a head, her hair black and stringy, clinging to gray skin that glistened in the moonlight. Her eyes opened, milky and endless, and her mouth stretched wide, spilling water as she climbed. Ryan froze, his flashlight being fixed on her face, his lips moving soundlessly. I screamed for him to run, but he didn't move. Her hand shot out, faster than anything dead should move, and closed around his throat. He didn't even fight. He just stared at me, eyes bulging, before she pulled him into the well with one smooth motion. His scream was cut short, swallowed by the darkness below. The water surged up the stones, splashing over the rim, soaking my shoes. I stumbled back, but the mud sucked at my feet, and for a moment I felt her eyes on me, dragging me forward. Somehow, I tore free and ran, tripping through the weeds, my lungs burning as the sound of her laugh followed me, bubbling and wet, echoing in my ears long after I had left the clearing behind.
I don't know why she let me go. Maybe she didn't. Maybe she's still waiting, biding her time. It's been months since that night, and I haven't seen Ryan or Megan or Jenna or any of them again. Their names aren't spoken in town anymore, just quiet murmurs, pitying looks, stories about kids who ran off or drowned or vanished. But I know the truth. I see it in my dreams every night. The well yawning open, her hands reaching up. I hear the drip of water in my room, the whisper of her name in the dark. Sometimes, when I wake, my sheets are soaked, my hair plastered to my face, and the smell of rot fills my lungs. I haven't been back to the clearing, but I don't need to. The well isn't just a place anymore. It's a door, and once opened, it never closes. I don't know how much longer I have before she comes for me too. All I know is that when she does, no one will find me. There will be no body, no trace, just water. Always water.